Thank you, Dr. Gard, for coming here. Robert Gard was the president of the Monterey Institute who hired me. Thank you. Well, we should all thank him because that's why we have Dr. Trenin here. It's one of the reasons. I will be very brief with my introduction. For those of you who are guests, perhaps first or second time here on campus, let me tell you a few words about my program. I'm a director of the Graduate Learning Initiative in Russian Studies, which is sponsored by Carnegie Corporation of New York. The goal of the program is to bring top Russian experts in Russian society, politics, security here to the Monterey Institute to enable our students, our graduate students, who are all, well, most of them are fluent in speaking Russian, and students, officers from Defense Threat Reduction Agency program at the Defense Language Institute, and Russian-speaking officers at Naval Postgraduate School come together and learn from the visiting experts and build a community of current and future experts on Russian language. Today we are hosting a very special guest. You know, when people ask me, often they ask me, so Anna, who is your favorite Russian writer? You know, Tolstoy, you know, Dostoevsky, you know, some great Russian poets like Anna Akhmatova, Irina Tsvetaeva, and also Tolstoy. And it's a very difficult question to answer because they're all extraordinary. They all represent the best of Russia and Russian culture. But I have no problem answering the question, who in your mind is the best expert on Russia, Russian foreign policy, and U.S.-Russian relations in the world? And the answer is Dr. Dmitri Trenin. I'm very grateful for you to come here. I'm grateful to my students who chose Russia as an area of expertise in Russian language, which is very difficult language as a language to study. I'm very grateful to the guests from outside the Institute. Thank you for coming and supporting us in your interest for Russia. I am very grateful to the faculty of Defense Language Institute and Naval Postgraduate School, to Professor Freeman and Professor Sipkin for the enthusiasm and support in bringing their students here for this program. And most of all, I'm grateful to Dr. Trenin and to Mrs. Vera Trenin, who is with us today. They flew for 24 hours, leaving Sheremetyevo, I believe it was at 4 in the morning, to come here to Monterey to share their expertise and to instill the understanding of the importance of U.S.-Russian relations for not only the future of the two countries, but for the global security and peace in the world. Our schedule will be the following. Dr. Trenin will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll take questions. At 1:30 sharp, I'm going to cut the program because we need to give our people 20 minutes to rest, because at 2 p.m. in B104, all the students and the officers who are visiting will have another 2-hour-long class with Dr. Trenin that will be taught in Russian. So those of you who would like to brush up your Russian, please come join us. And so the last 30 minutes of the session will be devoted to questions and answers. So the topic is why Russia matters to the United States of America. Dr. Trenin.
Well, good afternoon. President Gard, Professor Vasilova, it's a great honor, a big privilege for me and the honor to be with you this afternoon. It's not our first time in Monterey, but every time we come here, it's very pleasant. And to see friends and we get to know younger faces and first asked that question years ago, why Russia matters to the United States, I must confess I thought, what a silly question. The United States is a global power, and it goes without saying that all countries matter to the United States. And certainly Russia does matter to the United States. But clearly I understand the import of this question posed the way it is posed and posed today. Because for a long time, of course, the predecessor of the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, mattered enormously to the United States, to the Western world. But I would say it mattered by and large for the wrong reason. It was an adversary. It was seen as a threat. It was a competitor. And the United States, for almost 40 years or 50 years, was focused on the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was some hopes in this country and more broadly in the West, Russia would, and in Russia, that Russia would soon re-emerge as a democratic polity, as a free market society, as a strong partner of the United States, with certainly some understanding that it would be a junior partner of the United States. Now, those hopes have not been realized. And Russia finds itself today in a pretty unenviable position of being neither a threat nor an opportunity. So landing between the two chairs. And the question that Anna has posed is a very relevant one. Now, my thesis is that Russia, not only does it matter to the United States, but it matters more to the United States than most, and I would even say than all but very few countries around the world. I would also say that I believe that today, in contrast to the days of the Cold War, Russia is given a huge discount in the American public mind. And that is not, in my view, a healthy thing. And I will try to explain what I think about it. When Russia gets mentioned today, it's almost always for the wrong reason. When you discuss China, there's bad news and there's good news. And there's always some kind of a balance when in U.S. discussions of China. When you look at the discussion, the public discussion of Russia, it's overwhelmingly negative. There's democracy backsliding, which is true in many ways. There is the issue of human rights abuses, and there are many human rights cases in Russia, and human rights are a big issue in Russia, no question about that. There's an issue of pervasive corruption, which is all very true. Russia is often accused of being on the wrong side of history. Look at Syria. I would take an issue with that. We can discuss it. Russia is accused of bullying its neighbors. Again, it's an interesting issue for discussion. We can discuss Georgia. We can discuss Ukraine. Russia is often credited with aiding and abetting American adversaries, say Iran. Sometimes others are mentioned, from Hamas to North Korea. I would take an issue with that, again, a matter of discussion. But even then, Russia appears as a somewhat unworthy adversary. It is an adversary, you're right, but it's a caricature. It's a caricature of the old Soviet Union. It's the predecessor. So it appears to a lot of people, save and prudent to simply ignore Russia when they can. And I think this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Interestingly enough, it's difficult to place Russia in today's world. It's no longer deemed to be part of Europe. If you look at CNN maps of Europe, the map stops somewhere just east of Kiev. You look at the map of Asia, it goes as far north as the northern borders of China. So Russia is neither Asia nor Europe, which is interesting. Of course, there's a lot of awareness of seeing the same man in office, or at least in power, in Russia since 2000. And a lot of people are so tired of him that they would, it looks like they would accept any alternative if an alternative is to present itself. And of course, I'm talking about Mr. Putin. Elegantly put, there is a strong school in this country that advocates, elegantly put, strategic patience, less elegantly put, strategic oblivion, as far as Russia is concerned. Well, as I said, this is one way of looking at Russia, and I understand the reasons for taking that view. I mentioned that there was bitter disappointment following the collapse of communism in Russia. But let me add here that the difference between Russia and the countries that have made it from the communist camp, like Poland or other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, was that those who have made it were given an option of immigration into the expanded West. Russia was asking for that option, and President Yeltsin, the first Russian president after the fall of communism, came to Washington in April '92. He sat down with George H.W. Bush, and he said, we want to be allies in a formal sense of the word. We want to be like your NATO allies are to you, only bigger, more capable, more important to you. And Bush answered something like, alliance? What alliance? The Cold War is over, Mr. Yeltsin. We're no longer interested in alliances. Let's be partners. Fine. Then Mr. Yeltsin sent a letter to NATO, which said, in part, Russia expects to be a member of NATO in the near future. They sent that letter and watched the reaction. There was none. So 2 weeks later, another cable came from Moscow saying that the previous message from President Yeltsin contained a typo. So Russia does not expect to be a member of NATO in the near future. Well, it's a funny story, but there's a little tragedy behind it. At least the tragedy of a missed opportunity. So there was disappointment, and clearly a lot of that disappointment has to do with the difficulty of post-communist transformation in Russia. And I wouldn't want to minimize that. But if you look at the situation as a whole, responsibility for that disappointment needs to be shared. There's certainly a measure of fatigue with regard to Russia. Again, the hope was out there for far too long, and when the hopes were dispelled, fatigue set in, which is quite natural. There's a measure of moral opprobrium as far as various actions of the Russian government are concerned, and again, we can talk about that. And much of that opprobrium is actually justified. That is discussed with the leadership of Russia, which is pretty emotional, but it certainly has impact on how the leadership of Russia sees its partners in the West. What this approach to Russia is not based on, I think, is the U.S. national interest. A lot of that is emotional, as I said. A lot of that has to do with the history of the last 20, 25 years, but there's not much of a U.S. interest in taking that attitude toward Russia. And let me try to explain why I believe U.S. interests are affected when it comes to Russia. And I'll begin with the economy, which is a kind of strange thing to begin with, because Russia is not really credited with having much of a modern economy these days. But it's certainly progressed since the immediate post-Soviet period. I remember in the mid-1990s, Russia's GDP was equal to that of Belgium, and the Russian federal budget was equal to the budget of the city of New York. We're talking 1990s. Today, it's certainly one of the 10 top nations in terms of GDP, and it has a pretty substantial currency reserves. It was given to treating a lot of its problems with money in the last 10 years or so. It's still a relatively small economic unit. It accounts for under 3% of the global GDP. Well, not much, but again, 3% of the global GDP is something. It's slightly more than the Russian share of the global population. And in a few areas, it counts for a lot. It's either the first or the second producer of oil and gas. And it's, again, either the first or the second exporter of oil and gas in the world. It has abundant mineral resources, metals, things like that. Even in the trade, in the kind of trade that is often very sensitive, i.e. the global arms trade, Russia is a pretty serious player. It's the second most important exporter of arms and weapons in the world after the United States of America. The distance between Russia and the United States in that category is quite big, but Russia is exporting more than any other country in the world except for the United States of America. And it exports to the countries that the United States does not reach out to. It exports its weapons to China, weapons and technology. It's still the biggest arms exporter to India. It exports weapons to a number of other countries around the world. Again, many of them, or some of them, not really good friends of the United States. So it may matter for the wrong reason, but it does matter. Russia is also an exporter of nuclear power plants, nuclear technology around the world, and it's just built a nuclear power station in Iran. It's in the process of doing so in Turkey. Mr. Putin has just sat down with President Morsi of Egypt, and we talked about a nuclear power plant in Egypt. So it's pretty serious. Again, it's focused on a pretty important part of the world. Russia is also very rich in the resources that will become more important in the future, such as water. Russia has the biggest reservoirs of fresh water on Earth. A part of that water is contained in one lake in Siberia called Lake Baikal, which is enormously rich in fresh water. And countries in the area, starting with China, are very, very interested in precisely that kind of resource. And that makes Russia very important. Russia is also important as a market, becoming more important as a market. It entered the WTO in 2012, and it's now embarked on the road to the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It will take Russia many years, in my view, to reach that goal, but it's focused on that goal. True, the Russian-American trade exchange is minuscule. We're talking something like $30 billion US, not a huge amount of money. But Russia's trade with Europe, for example, is over $400 billion. Russia's trade with China is just under $100 billion. So there are very important trade flows between Russia and those two key trading partners in Eurasia, the EU in the west and China in the east. And actually, as Russia's society is becoming richer, Russia is consuming more and more of other people's exports. It's the second largest car market in Europe, just after Germany. Russia's population, which is about 140 million people, has stopped, at least for the moment, has stopped declining. And it may be, the government hopes it may be stabilized. At least the dire expectations of Russia dying out are not being borne by the reality for now. And the purchasing power of that group is growing. Russia's GDP per capita is about 15% lower than in Poland. I'm not talking Moscow, I'm talking Russia as a whole. But it's about 1/3 higher than Turkey's. And it's on a par with such EU member states as Croatia in the Balkans or Latvia in the Baltic Sea. And even if Russia continues to lose people, even the direst scenarios of Russia's population catastrophe, even if those become a reality, Russia in 2050 will have, and this is the worst, absolutely the worst case scenario, will have as many people as the Russian Soviet Republic had in 1950. So everything is kind of relative. And even then, even if the worst comes to worst, Russia will be bigger than any other country in Europe, if of course you consider Russia. It's bigger than Germany, it's bigger than Turkey, that's going to overtake Germany in the years to come.
Let me now talk a little bit about the geopolitics of Russia. It's still a country which stretches along, well, and just before Mr. Medvedev's time, it was 11 time zones. Mr. Medvedev contracted a few times, merged a few time zones, so it's now 9 time zones. But it's still a country that stretches roughly from the borders of Norway to the borders of North Korea. And it's a country which occupies much of North Eurasia between the Arctic coast and Afghanistan. It's actually America's direct neighbor. Of course, Sarah Palin knows that. She can look at Russia from the window. The shortest distance between U.S. territory and Russian territory in the Bering Sea is 3 miles.
How much?
Even less than that. It's 2.5 miles. And I would say that Europe's security and prosperity, and clearly Europe, with not all this pivot notwithstanding to Asia and the Pacific, Europe still matters a lot to the US, and will matter a lot to the US. No question in my mind about that. But Europe's security and Europe's prosperity does depend a lot on how Europe structures its relations with the Russian Federation. The nature and the quality of those relations will define Europe's role, in part, define Europe's role in the 21st century world. Look at China. Russia and China share 2,700 miles of border. For China, Russia is now a safe rear and a resource base. If China were not confident in the stability of its rear, it would be a very different international player now. For the Chinese, it means a lot to be sure that there's no such thing as a northern threat coming from Russia. It's also a critical relationship to China in terms of access to all sorts of natural resources. Of course, China gets a lot of things from a lot of places, but most of the lines of communication can be relatively easily cut, whether in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean. Now, the lines that connect China and Russia can only be cut if you consider bombing territory of a nuclear superpower. And from the Chinese perspective, those are extremely valuable for China's strategic stability, for China's security and strategic stability. It's very clear that the Chinese understand that. The Chinese president, Mr. Xi Jinping, paid his first visit since becoming president to Russia. That was big news, but he was only following in the tradition of his predecessor, Mr. Hu Jintao, who did the same in the early 2000s. The Chinese realize the importance of the Russia relationship. The Chinese may be a bit perplexed by the rather cavalier treatment of Russia in the foreign policy pivot article authored by Hillary Clinton. And she mentioned all countries by name in the Asia-Pacific region, with the exception of Russia, which was very, very interesting. I was also told that you can, and you will tell me whether this is true or not, but I was told by my friends and colleagues here that you can spend hours discussing China and the Pentagon, and the word Russia will never come up. Again, this is interesting. I will not comment on that, but it's very interesting. It's also interesting if you compare that with, Vera and I were recently in two places in the Pacific, in Sydney, Australia, and in Singapore. And the entrance to both harbors are guarded by forts, built, of course, by the British in the 19th century, and guess against whom those forts were built. It was the Russian Imperial Navy. It's interesting against this background to hear a very senior Australian diplomat who once confided in me that, saying that before the convening of the APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Vladivostok, Russia, in September of 2012, they had not really realized that Russia had been in the Pacific coast. Again, this is it's interesting because it, in my view, because it points to certain flaws that are best identified and addressed in the names of the national issues. And I will continue at a higher tempo. We don't have all that much time before the more interesting part of this dialogue starts. Before I turn the floor over to you, Russia has a traditional relationship with India. Russia was very important for various parts of the Muslim world, starting with post-American Afghanistan. Pakistan, there's a budding relationship between Moscow and Islamabad. Iran, a very old relationship that's seen a lot of ups and downs. Turkey, another very old relationship. The Arab world, Israel, and of course Russia is in the business of working on what Mr. Putin calls the Eurasian Union of some of the former Soviet states. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Let me pass on to the next subject, Russia's antiquated military. True, Russia's military was left neglected for 20 plus years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And frankly, as someone who served in the military, I really don't know another uniformed force anywhere in the world that would have put up with the conditions in which the Soviet and then Russian military were placed following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Truly abominable, truly a huge responsibility that rests with the Russian government, from Mr. Gorbachev on right until Putin's time. Russia is still a nuclear superpower, and for the reasons we can discuss, it doesn't look for an exit from the nuclear club. In fact, it has enhanced its reliance on nuclear deterrence, also to compensate for its conventional weakness. But the conventional military is being, at long last, is being revamped. Something like $700 billion has been assigned to military modernization in the next few years. Russia is building its SOCOM, its Special Operations Command. The Russian Navy, for the first time in 20 years, is back in the Mediterranean at a very modest level, but it's clear that they want to play a role outside of Russia's coastal waters. Russia is expanding its Pacific fleet, following an old adage that not an old adage, a new adage rather, that the definition of a great power in the 21st century is the power of the Navy in the Pacific. So they are building that up. But it's essentially a country that sees itself strategically on the defensive. It sees itself being overwhelmed in terms of national might and military might by the United States, and increasingly by China. There's no appetite for military adventure on the Russian part. And the only case of the Russian military's cross-border action was, of course, Georgia in 2008. Again, we can discuss that. My penultimate point, penultimate point when it comes to this argumentation why it matters is a notion that Russia is too stubborn and too difficult to deal with. I think I would agree with that in large part. It is a stubborn player. It's not easy to deal with it. But let me explain. Russia sees itself as one of very few countries around the world that can boast of strategic independence. The Kremlin perspective, in today's world, there are very few truly independent players. The United States is one, China is another, and that's about it. India is a maybe for the future, but that's where the list stops. And Russia sees itself as a member of that select group of nations that have the luxury of being, if not luxury, maybe luxury is the wrong word, but have the capacity of acting independently in the world on on the basis of their own worldviews and their national interests. It's certainly a P5 member. It's a member of the G8, the G20, the BRICS Club, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but that's not the most important thing. Again, the most important thing is that it is a country that that can and does act independently, even when it has to reckon with the criticism from this country. It's, if you like, it's a country that can stand up to the United States criticism. It's a country that is a rare case in China's vicinity that's not totally mesmerized by the rise of China. It's not gone panic for the Chinese rise. I had a conversation with a senior U.S. official, good friend, former ambassador, former senior national security official. On his ambassadorial tour in Asia, he was asked by Indian people whether he thought, he had some, of course, background in Russian studies, why he thought, the Indian friends asked him, why he thought in that part of the world where everyone was afraid of China, the Russians seemed to be unafraid. And the Indian offered several options. The Russians being foolish, the Russians being too much focused on themselves, and the Russians being too much focused on the United States. Interesting, but it's certainly, we can, I don't have time to discuss this at length, Sino-Russian relations, but this is a measure of Russia's maturity as a power. The fact that the Russians have not lost their heads over the rise of China. For a long time, ever since China and Russia first came into contact, the Russians looked down on China. And even in 1979, China's GDP equaled 40% of the GDP of the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union. Today, of course, China's GDP is four times bigger than the GDP of the Russian Federation. And yet the Russians have not lost their heads over China. Interesting and positive. The Russians have their own view of the world, which is informed by their unique experience, 1,000 years of history. It's not 5,000 years as in China's case, but it's years is a long time, as we all know. It's been through a lot in those years, especially the last few years, including Afghanistan, being there, seen that, been in, been out, and tell stories. Iran, we had our own embassy not captured, decimated, with ambassador killed. Well, that happened in the 19th century, but still very much at the back of people's minds. So, interesting relationship. The Arabs, people can compare Arab revolutions of today with the Arab democratic revolutions, if you like, of today, with the swing toward Arab socialism in the 1960s, and make some comparisons. There's a lot there. There's a richness of experience, as I said. It's surprisingly flexible. I never thought that Russia would be as flexible as it actually has been. It's one former empire, one former ideological mecca, one former great power and superpower that has been able to bounce back. And unlike the other powers that lost and have been subsumed within the new world order, whether we're talking Germany and Japan, or whether we're talking Britain and France, they've been subsumed within this new order. The Russians have bounced back, and they are a great power today. They're not an empire. They're not an ideological center. They're not a superpower, but they're a great power. And the notion of what constitutes a great power has changed interestingly. It's not so much a power that lords over others. It's a power that prevents others to lord over itself. And that, in today's world, this is an interesting view of what the great power is. Now, let me conclude almost by just highlighting that we can discuss the Russian political system. Some people call it dictatorship, some people call it Stalin-like, some people say that Russia is less democratic than China. I think that all these things are very interesting, and they demand an interesting discussion. Although there's no question that Russia is an authoritarian polity that is ruled by the modern equivalent of the Tsar, no question about that in my mind. The real story in Russia is the awakening and the gradual maturing of society. And that is maybe a slow-moving process, but it's a process that moves ahead and that moves in the right direction. Again, we can talk about this, but let me just say that, of course, there's a long road to a political nation. The next station for Russia is the rule of law. It's up to the Russians to decide what Russia of the future would look like and what kind of a political system it would have. In my view, interference with that process from the outside is damaging. And a bit of humility is certainly in order. You're trying to understand before you engage is absolutely a must. So let me conclude by saying that Russia does matter, is to be an established fact. How to deal with Russia, this is the real issue. And a lot of people are discussing the relationship between values and interests in foreign policy, and I think it's, in a way, a pretty sterile debate because one's interests are very intimately connected with one's values. The values actually frame the interests in many ways. And I'm sure that Americans should absolutely speak their minds on what's happening in and with Russia, but they need first to understand or try to understand what is it that's going on there. And when they act, they need to focus not only on the input and output, but even more so on the possible outcome of their actions. And to achieve its goals, the United States does and will need partners around the world. And frankly, very few partners are easy. And those who are easy are often less worthy than those who are not. And very, very finally, let me give you in very random order a list of what I think could be American foreign policy priorities. In my view, they're all intimately related to Russia. Nuclear proliferation, international terrorism, the rise of Asia, including the rise of China, the Arab awakening, the Muslim revival, regional stability, especially across Eurasia, cybersecurity, climate change, the Arctic. So my humble opinion, one needs to take a strategic view of that place because it does matter hugely to the United States. If Russia does not disappear, it's likely to be an important, and even more important, international factor. And Russia is unlikely to go away. And those of you who chose Russia chose wisely. It's a country with a past, but it's not a country of the past. It's certainly a country with a future and of the future. Thank you so much.
Let's take some questions, and if you would please introduce question, and I have, yes, I owe the opportunity to ask the first question to the lady, who might prefer to ask it in Russian at 2 o'clock. По-русски. Okay, all right. See, we have some who prefer to speak Russian. All right. So, question in English, please. In English.
Hi, my name is Maria Bull, and I have more of an economic question to you. You mentioned earlier that the GDP per capita since the early 90s has increased for Russia. However, it's still 4 times less than the Chinese market, Chinese GDP per capita.
Not per capita. The Chinese GDP
I'm
growth.
sorry, yeah. So it has increased, but it's still not high enough. What policies can they adjust to increase the GDP per capita and reduce the poverty, quantity of poverty in Russia?
Well, I give you a very short answer to that question. Labor productivity. Russian labor productivity is 25% of labor productivity in the United States.
Robert Gard, I'm retired military and currently with a non-government organization concerned with the very first item that you mentioned in U.S. foreign policy, namely nuclear non-proliferation. And my question is related to the New START Treaty, which I considered a very favorable milestone for both countries. And hopefully there will be further negotiations and reductions, because clearly neither country needs all the nuclear weapons that we have. But the stumbling block now is the United States missile defense program. And in particular, the ground-based mid-course system, which intercepts warheads above the atmosphere in space. Now, the Russians are asking for a legal document to guarantee that we're not targeting Russia. But it's well known among scientific circles that the ground-based mid-course system can be defeated easily by even simple countermeasures. And when one hears the Russian objections to the U.S. missile defense system, occasionally it's interspersed with a comment, most recently I believe from your deputy foreign minister, that the Russians indeed can defeat the U.S. missile defense system with their strategic arsenal, and it's not a matter of concern. So why is this such a stumbling block?
Well, sir, I think this is truly a key sticky point in U.S.-Russian strategic relations. My take on that was this. Well, first of all, I think that when I talked about Russia's feeling of, the Russian leadership's feeling of strategic independence, vis-a-vis the United States in particular, it's very much rests on the continuing power of the twins. Unfortunately, to live in this post-Cold War world, which still has a lot of elements borrowed from the past, clearly, the deterrence today is very different from the deterrence of the days of the Cold War. It's more of a matter of national prestige and this feeling, as I call it, strategic independence. The Russians generally have a lot of respect for American science and technology. And they bought into the Star Wars in the 1980s. They overreacted to President Reagan's programs that largely remained on paper. But that contributed to the overstretch of Soviet resources. This propensity to give more credit to American science and technology and more credit to the ability of the United States to implement its plans is still there. And the Russians are basically saying that they're not so much focused, or they're not so much threatened by regional missile defense, whether that's in Europe or elsewhere, but by American capability at some point to build a global system that would blunt Russian deterrence capability. And in a situation in which the Russian government does not place more trust in the U.S. government than vice versa, you have strategic insecurity on the Russian side as the weaker side in this relationship. So this would be my diagnosis of the Russian strategic psyche. I don't think that the idea of legally binding guarantees makes sense. In my view, it doesn't. There was a fine treaty that existed between the Soviet Union and the United States, and then between Russia and the United States on missile defense. That was a treaty of unlimited duration, and a lot of people thought it was a perpetual treaty. But in fact, Article 15 of that treaty stipulated that you could withdraw from that treaty within, after having notified the other party 6 months before your intended withdrawal, which is precisely what President George W. Bush did in the fall of 2001, excuse me. So legally binding things are, in my view, meaningless. And then you think about having that treaty going through U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate, and you will probably rue the day when you thought about legally binding guarantees. In my view, the best way to address that would be to start doing something together in Europe, to begin with. I'm not totally convinced that this is impossible. My colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment and myself initiated a project a couple of years ago that brought together very senior officials, former officials from the United States, Russia, and Europe to discuss matters of Euro-Atlantic security with an emphasis on missile defense. And there was agreement in our working group on missile defense about how this cooperation could be organized. And in my view, had that proposal been taken up, it was delivered to the Kremlin, the White House, and the chancelleries of Europe. Had that proposal been taken up, we would have been placed on a track that would lead to progressively diminishing the residual mistrust between the United States and Russia and building new trust between them. And that to me is the way to overcome deterrence. You cannot simply declare null and void. You cannot do that. But through cooperation, you can change totally the nature of the strategic relationship from semi-adversarial today to a predominantly cooperative relationship of the future. I still think that there is that we can advance along that axis. It may take a number of years, but I just don't see any other. Arms control, to me, New START treaty included, is essentially a way to regulate relations among adversaries or between adversaries. So you need to go beyond arms control towards strategic collaboration. That's a mental revolution. But I have no illusions in my mind that it's going to be very, very different. But that's the way.
Thank you very much for a very insightful commentary on why Russia matters to the United States. I have a question about U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. When the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were some analysts, both in Washington and Tokyo, that began to suggest that the Cold War strategic rationale that supported and sustained the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance was gone, and whether or not the alliance would go adrift with U.S. and Japanese security political interests overlapping, but still moving in different directions. But with the rise of China, it appears that both Washington and Tokyo agree that that strategic alliance, the military alliance between the United States and Japan, has a different rationale that should be sustained and even strengthened. I wonder if you would like to comment on your personal or Russia's mainstream thinking on the role that the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance plays in the Asia-Pacific region, and whether or not Japan becoming an independent political entity moving away from the alliance in the future is a positive direction or a negative direction from the perspective of Russia.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senor, for this very insightful question. Let me say that what I think is probably far less important than what the mainstream Russian view is of that relationship. You won't find very much in the Russian debate about this security relationship, which in my view is very dumb. Basically, it means that the Russians do not feel threatened by this continuing alliance. You only need to compare that with Russian criticisms of NATO, NATO's enlargement, in NATO's sheer continuation of its existence, of its role in Europe. But there is very little, in fact, there is no criticism of the U.S.-Japan security alliance. I think from the Russian perspective, this is a necessary element of the strategic balance in Asia-Pacific. And they note the rise of China. They don't see China as a threat now or in the foreseeable future. But China is a big boy, getting bigger. And the Russians have a very developed strategic culture based on balances. And maybe a bit antiquated. But it's, I think it's basically all right when it comes to Asia and China in particular. I think that the Russians would find themselves in a very tight place if relations between China and the United States exacerbated up to a certain point. They don't want to be placed between the United States and China. They cannot choose sides without really major losses themselves. They will only do so if either party turns against Russia. Then they will have to join with the other party. Otherwise, they would prefer to stay neutral in this situation. They're reaching out to Japan strategically. I understand that next week, Prime Minister Abe is traveling to Moscow, just a month after the visit by President Xi Jinping. The Chinese are a little bit worried. I received an invitation from the Global Times to to write an op-ed and calm them down, which I did. They want their relationship with Japan normalized. They want to do away with the territorial dispute, and they are prepared to make certain concessions, not as much in the view of the Japanese, but they are really focused on having some kind of a compromise with Japan. I don't think that they would welcome Japan as an independent player. And frankly, I do not see Japan as an independent player. I do not see in Japan what it takes to become an independent strategic player in the 21st century. I just don't see it. They talk about it, but it's not as easy as some people may imagine. I believe that this talk is essentially addressed to the United States. I think that Japan is really trying to get more U.S. backing for its policies vis-a-vis China than Japan is getting. I think that from the Japanese perspective, and you tell me whether I'm wrong or not, but the very distant neighbor, as some people say, of Japan. In my view, the Japanese at the same time welcome the pivot because it focuses America's attention on their part of the world and on their alliance with the United States in particular. But at the same time, the pivot suggests that there's a lot at stake for the United States in its relations with China. And there's a trade-off between the two. And they're not feeling fully secure. And I think that they're reaching out to Russia, which I think makes a lot of sense from the Japanese point of view, to have a relationship, a better relationship with a country that, as I said, shares 2,700 miles of common border with China. That is a supplier of certain things to China. That's China's strategic rear. And China, will have to think twice about doing something that would hamper Russia's interests. So there's some sense in the Japanese reaching out to Russia. But there's absolutely no justification for some Japanese hopes, and they can be found in this small group of right-wing thinkers in Japan of a Japan-Russia alliance against China. This is totally out of the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trenin, for your wonderful presentation, which thank you for making this happen for us. You mentioned that you take a different stance on Russia-Syria relations. Can you please elaborate more on that? Thank you.
Russia-Syria. Let me say that what I think Russia-Syria policy is based on. I think it's based on three things. At the top level is the concern about the global order. And this is essentially about who uses force in today's world, who mandates the use of force, who watches over those who use force, and other things of this kind, which means that there should be no intervention at will. In practical terms, there should be no intervention that's not approved by Russia in the Security Council, which is the essence of the Russian position. Which I think is, of course, it's very much based on the Russian national interest, but it's a concept of global order that the Russians have advanced. So this is the top layer. The middle layer is the Russian reading of the Arab Spring. And early on, from early 2011, when so many people, especially in Europe, but also in this country, were talking about a new 1989 breaking out in the Arab world. 89, of course, is the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall in Europe. Or a new 1848, again, another year of revolutions spreading around Europe, democratic revolutions. When the Russians thought about the proper historical analogy to what was happening in the Arab world, they came up with 1917 in Russia, but they were not sure which month would be the defining month. And for some, it was the Islamist October that looked like the likely candidate. And I think today, 2.5 years into the Arab Spring, almost, they believe that a lot of that has been vindicated by the realities on the ground. And they are very much afraid that this revolt, whatever, is supporting Islamist forces, which doesn't mean the same thing as extremist forces, but the extremists could be the next group profiting from the tumultuous developments in the Arab world, and they see the democratic and especially liberal forces in the Arab world being outnumbered and overwhelmed by other forces. So they take a very cautious approach toward the Arab world. The support that they give to President Assad, who is not an ally of Russia, but he, from the Russian perspective, he is someone who is fighting against Islamist forces that contain a very big extremist element in their midst. And in that situation, it's better that those people are contained as long as possible by the forces of the Damascus regime than to push Assad out of power and see Syria being taken over by people who will be a problem to not only to the Russians, but to a lot of people around the world. Many experts agree these days that a possible future for Syria would be an Afghanistan on the map. Afghanistan in the sense of a collection of warring groups vying for power in the country, as they did in Afghanistan after the fall of the pro-Soviet regime of Najibullah back in 1992. Whether this will be or will not be the future, we will see, but it's a hard situation. It's not that they want Assad because they somehow see him as an ally, because they are somehow involved geopolitically in the Arab world. They are not involved geopolitically in the Arab world at all. In 1972, when President Sadat of Egypt made an about-face in his foreign policy, booted out 20,000 Soviet military advisors, with many thousands of Soviet military specialists remaining in Egypt. That was one kind of Russian, one pattern of Russian involvement in the Middle East. Today, when Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, was booted out of power in 2011, there were 40,000 Russians stranded in Egypt, all of them tourists holidaymaking on the beaches of Hurghada, Sharm el-Sheikh, and a few other places. The Russian involvement with the Middle East is totally different today from what it was in the days of the Cold War. There's zero geopolitical interest in my view. But Assad is the last man standing from the standpoint of the Kremlin in Syria between some kind of authoritarianism, old style, and the extremism that is likely to come in the wake of the Islamist wave that is likely to overwhelm Assad at some point.
There's time for one more question.
Hi there. I'm having a rant from IPS program in current students. And my question is also about nuclear proliferation. So my question is, how would you see Russia's position on North Korea nuclear issue right now?
Well, I think that Russia's position is, in principle, same as the position of the United States and the other G8 member states of North Korea. This is the sense of the statement that the G8 foreign ministers made last month, or even this month, early this month, when the North Korea nuclear issue was discussed in London. In more practical terms, the Russians believe that sanctions are often the wrong instrument to use because they empower the wrong kinds of people and disempower those who might be amenable to some kind of compromise. The Russians are only developing, I think, their own position. Let me put it this way, not exactly. I think that the Russians are now developing a position on Korea, not just the nuclear aspect, but the entire Korean issue, including reunification, including the future of Korea. That would be part of their Asia-Pacific strategy. And in that, they are focusing increasingly on their relations with Seoul. But they're trying to engage Pyongyang into some kind of economic cooperation that would give Kim and his subjects a legal way of getting some money to keep themselves, keep themselves alive for some, to keep themselves in power for others. Through such projects as Trans-Korean pipeline, a gas pipeline, Trans-Korean railway that would give North Korea something, kind of cash that they would be able to use. And I think that the relationship with South Korea has been progressing. But on North Korea, the Russians are very, very negative and very critical. They were not amused a couple of years ago when North Korean missile misfired and landed 100 miles off the Russian coast, off Vladivostok. They were not amused. So that's what they are.
It could be like 1,001 nights in Russian politics. I never wanted to end, but let me make a pitch for the Carnegie Center in Moscow, which Dr. Trenin is a director, because you can go www.carnegie.ru and find extraordinary publications, series of plus books, of the books by Dr. Trenin that were published. I'm not going to enumerate them, but they're all extraordinary insights in Russian domestic and foreign policy, and the publications of the colleagues of Dr. Trenin on Russian politics really, for us, it's a primary message. Aside from Nevada Center, that's one of the primary resources for our studies. And, that's not an easy feat to pull, and it just appeared under the directorship of Dr. Trenin, playing that role. I'm always thinking think tank, not in terms of tank where the fish is contained, but tank that's moving and has an impact. And I thank you for coming. Thank you very much.